Jake Miller had been cleaning the Galactic Research Station for 3 years now, and he thought he knew every sound these metal halls could make. The gentle whoosh of the air recyclers, the soft beep of security doors, the distant hum of the massive engines that kept this floating city spinning through space. But tonight was different. Tonight, something was very wrong. He pushed his cleaning cart slowly down the long corridor, his rubber wheels squeaking against the polished floor. The xenobiology wing was supposed to be peaceful at this hour. Most of the alien diplomats and their families would be resting in their quarters, following whatever sleep cycles their home worlds had programmed into their bodies over millions of years. Jake liked the quiet. It gave him time to think, to observe, to appreciate just how incredible his life had become. A kid from rural Ohio, now working alongside beings from across the galaxy. But tonight, piercing cries shattered that familiar silence. The sound was raw, desperate, and utterly heartbreaking. It reminded Jake of his neighbor's baby back home, the way little Tommy would scream during those long nights when nothing seemed to help. But this was different somehow, more alien, yet strangely familiar in its pure distress. Jake followed the sound to Section C7, the diplomatic housing unit reserved for the Kithran delegation. Through the thick, reinforced viewing panel, he could see inside their living quarters. What he witnessed made his chest tighten with recognition and sympathy. 3 small creatures, each about the size of a house cat, were crying with an intensity that seemed to shake their entire bodies. They looked like a cross between foxes and small bears, with thick, silvery fur and large, expressive eyes that were now red from exhaustion and tears. Their tiny paws reached out desperately as they wailed, seeking something their parents couldn't seem to provide. The adult Kithrans were massive compared to their offspring, standing nearly 7 feet tall with the same silvery fur but marked with intricate patterns that probably indicated their rank or family lineage. Jake watched as they moved around their children with what could only be described as mechanical efficiency. One parent offered a small bowl of some glowing liquid to the nearest cub. When the child pushed it away and continued crying, the adult simply set the bowl down and picked up another item, something that looked like a high-tech pacifier. The universal translator mounted near the door crackled to life, converting the Kithran language into words Jake could understand. Sleep cycle disruption continues for 72 hours. Nutritional intake remains adequate. Medical intervention may be required. The voice was flat, emotionless, like a computer reading diagnostic information. Jake frowned. These weren't medical reports they were discussing. These were their own children, frightened and exhausted, crying for comfort that seemed beyond their parents' ability to provide. Dr. Emily Watson came rushing down the corridor, her white coat flapping behind her like wings. Jake had always liked her. Unlike some of the other specialists on the station, she treated him like a real person, not just the guy who emptied the trash cans. Her face was drawn tight with worry and frustration. "Jake," she said, barely pausing as she passed him. "The Kithran cubs haven't slept in 72 hours. We've tried everything. Dietary adjustments, environmental modifications, even the most advanced childcare units from 6 different worlds. Nothing works." She stopped at the viewing panel, and Jake could see the defeat in her shoulders. Inside the quarters, the crying had grown even more desperate. The cubs were crawling over each other, seeking warmth and comfort, but their parents continued their methodical, ineffective attempts at care. "The problem is," Dr. Watson continued, pressing her palm against the cool metal of the viewing panel, "Kithrans evolved past the need for emotional comfort behaviors millions of years ago. They're incredibly advanced, but they've lost the instincts that mammals like us take for granted. They can feed their young and keep them safe, but they don't know how to soothe them." More specialists began arriving, representatives from various species who served as child development experts on the station. Jake recognized a few of them from his cleaning rounds. There was Dr. Reginald Hayes from the Terran Medical Division, a tall Zenthri advisor whose name Jake couldn't pronounce, and several others whose expertise was supposedly unmatched in the galaxy. They huddled together outside the quarters, speaking in low, urgent tones. Jake caught fragments of their conversation through the translator. Technical terms, medical jargon, proposed interventions that sounded more like engineering solutions than childcare. "Sedation appears to be our only remaining option," Dr. Watson announced to the group, her voice heavy with reluctance. "If they don't sleep soon, their developing neural pathways could suffer permanent damage." Jake felt something cold settle in his stomach. Sedation? For babies who were just scared and tired? He set down his mop and took a step closer to the group of specialists. They barely noticed him, too focused on their charts and readings and complex theories. Inside the quarters, one of the cubs had crawled to the very edge of their sleeping area, pressing its small body against the transparent wall that separated it from the corridor. Its large eyes seemed to look directly at Jake, and in that moment, he saw something the specialists had missed entirely. These weren't medical cases or diplomatic complications. They were just children who needed someone to care. Jake set down his mop and moved toward the door, his heart pounding with the crazy certainty that sometimes the simplest solutions were the ones everyone overlooked. Security Chief Tom Bradley was reaching for his communicator when he noticed the janitor stepping toward the sealed entrance of the Kithran quarters. "Sir, you can't just," he started, but Jake Miller was already punching in the access code he'd memorized from watching the medical staff come and go. The heavy door slid open with a soft hiss, and Jake stepped inside before anyone could stop him. The crying hit him like a physical wave, so much louder and more desperate than it had sounded through the reinforced walls. The air inside was thick with the scent of alien flowers and something that reminded him of cinnamon, probably the Kithran equivalent of air freshener. The two adult Kithrans immediately spun toward him, their massive bodies tensing for a threat. Their fur literally stood on end, making them appear even larger and more intimidating. Jake had never been this close to them before, and he was struck by how their eyes glowed with an inner light, like amber with fire trapped inside. They made low, rumbling sounds that the universal translator couldn't seem to process, probably warning sounds that were too primitive for the machine to recognize. Jake raised both hands slowly, palms out, the way he'd approach a spooked horseback on his family's farm in Ohio. "Easy," he said softly, though he knew they couldn't understand his words without the translator. "I'm not here to hurt anyone." The larger of the two adults, probably the father, took a step forward, his claws extending slightly from his massive paws. But Jake wasn't looking at the adults anymore. His attention was completely focused on the three small creatures huddled together in the center of the room, their tiny bodies shaking with exhaustion and fear. Without really thinking about it, Jake began to hum. It was an old song, something his mother used to sing when storms would roll across the Ohio countryside and shake their little farmhouse. She'd sit on his bed during those long nights, humming this melody while lightning lit up his bedroom windows. He'd never known the actual words, but the tune had stayed with him all these years, buried somewhere deep in his memory until this moment. The sound that came from his throat was soft and wordless, rising and falling like a gentle breeze. It wasn't fancy or sophisticated, just a simple human expression of comfort that his species had been sharing for thousands of years. The closest cub stopped crying mid-wail, its small head tilting to one side as if trying to understand this new sound. Jake knelt down slowly, continuing to hum while making gentle swaying motions with his upper body. It was instinctive, the way people rock crying babies or sway while holding them. "Hey there, little ones," Jake said in the softest voice he could manage. "It's okay. You're safe." The largest of the three cubs, the one who had been crying the loudest, began crawling across the soft floor toward Jake. Its movements were unsteady, like a kitten that hadn't quite figured out how its legs worked, but there was determination in those glowing amber eyes. Jake held perfectly still, letting the small creature make its own choice. When the cub reached him, it pressed its warm, fuzzy body against Jake's leg and made a sound that was half purr, half whimper. Jake's heart nearly broke at the trust in that simple gesture. Carefully, moving as slowly as he would with the most delicate glass, Jake lifted the cub and cradled it against his chest. The little creature was heavier than it looked, solid and warm, and Jake could feel its tiny heart beating rapidly against his uniform. He continued humming, feeling the cub's breathing gradually slow as it settled into the rhythm of his voice. The other two cubs had stopped crying now and were crawling toward him, drawn by something they couldn't understand but desperately needed. Outside the quarters, Jake could see the faces pressed against the viewing panel. Dr. Watson's mouth was hanging open in shock. Several other specialists had arrived, their alien features unreadable but their body language screaming disbelief. "That's highly irregular," Dr. Watson whispered to someone Jake couldn't see. Her voice carried clearly through the room's audio system, meant to help medical staff monitor the occupants. Jake felt a second cub climb into his lap while he continued to hold the first. The third wrapped itself around his ankle like the world's most exotic house cat. All three had stopped crying completely, and the silence felt miraculous after hours of desperate wailing. The adult Kithran stood frozen, watching this impossible scene unfold. Their fur had settled back down, and Jake could see confusion in their glowing eyes. They tried everything their advanced civilization had taught them, every technological solution and medical intervention their species had developed over millions of years of evolution. But this simple human was succeeding where they had failed, using nothing but his voice and gentle movements. Station Commander Lisa Hayes arrived just as Jake was settling all three cubs against his chest, their small bodies finally relaxed and peaceful. Jake had met the commander only once before, during his initial orientation 3 years ago. She was known throughout the station as brilliant but demanding, someone who expected perfection from everyone under her command. Her expression as she looked through the viewing panel was fascinating to watch. It started as annoyance, probably irritated that station protocols were being violated. But as she observed the scene, her face slowly transformed. The tight lines around her eyes softened, and something like wonder crept into her features. "How is a janitor succeeding where our best specialists failed?" she whispered to Dr. Watson, her voice carrying clearly through the audio system. Jake pretended not to hear the question, focusing instead on the 3 small lives now sleeping peacefully in his arms. For the first time in 72 hours, the diplomatic quarters were completely quiet except for the soft sound of his humming and the gentle breathing of 3 exhausted alien children who had finally found what they'd been crying for all along. Someone who simply cared enough to try. Jake had barely finished his shift the next morning when he noticed someone waiting by the maintenance storage room. The figure was tall and elegant, with skin that shimmered like oil on water and eyes that held depths Jake couldn't quite understand. He recognized her immediately as Ambassador Kira of the Deltan Republic, one of the most important diplomatic figures on the station. She approached him hesitantly, which was strange. Jake had never seen any of the ambassadors look uncertain about anything. These were beings who negotiated treaties between star systems and spoke for entire civilizations. But here she was, wringing her hands like a nervous parent. "Mr. Miller," she said, her voice carrying that musical quality that made Deltan's speech so distinctive. "I hope you don't mind me approaching you like this. Word has traveled quickly through the diplomatic quarters about what happened last night with the Kithrin cubs." Jake set down his cleaning supplies and gave her his full attention. "Is everything okay, Ambassador?" "My offspring," she said, and Jake could hear the worry in her voice despite the alien accent. "She has been experiencing similar difficulties with her rest cycles. The medical staff has tried various interventions, but nothing seems to help. I was wondering if could you possibly demonstrate your technique?" Jake blinked in surprise. Here was a representative of one of the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy, asking a janitor for help with childcare. But when he looked into her eyes, he didn't see an ambassador anymore. He just saw a worried mother. "Of course," he said simply. "Lead the way." Within an hour, Jake found himself in the Deltan quarters, facing a small creature that looked like a cross between a dolphin and a hummingbird. The child was floating in a specialized rest chamber filled with some kind of glowing liquid, but despite all the high-tech equipment, she was clearly distressed. Her small body trembled, and she made soft clicking sounds that the universal translator identified as crying. Jake knelt beside the chamber and began humming the same melody that had worked with the Kithrin cubs. The Deltan child stopped clicking immediately, her large, dark eyes focusing on him with intense curiosity. Jake started making gentle hand gestures, the kind of simple movements that had entertained human babies for generations. To his amazement, the child began mimicking his movements, her distress melting away as she became absorbed in this simple interaction. "Remarkable," Ambassador Kira whispered. "She hasn't been this calm in weeks." By the time Jake finished his rounds that day, he'd been called to 7 different quarters. Word was spreading through the diplomatic community like wildfire, passed along in quiet conversations and urgent messages. The Zenthari delegate, an insect-like being with compound eyes and 4 arms, watched in fascination as Jake played peekaboo with her offspring. The simple game worked perfectly, even though the child's anatomy was completely different from a human's. The basic joy of surprise and reunion translated across millions of years of evolution. "This is extraordinary," Dr. Watson said, following Jake with her medical scanner as he moved from family to family. "I'm reading consistent drops in stress hormones across all species. Cortisol levels, adrenaline, even alien equivalents I don't have names for. This is unprecedented in xenobiology research." Jake was sitting on the floor of the Trilaxian quarters, helping a child who looked like a small, furry bear stack colorful blocks into towers. The child would build them up, knock them down, and giggle with delight at the simple cause and effect. It was the most basic form of play, something human children had enjoyed for thousands of years. The Trilaxian representative, Ambassador David Chen, stood watching with an expression of complete bewilderment. His people were known for their efficiency, their technological mastery, their ability to optimize every aspect of their civilization. "We eliminated such inefficiencies millennia ago," he said, his voice carrying a note of confusion. "Our automated care pods can regulate every aspect of childhood development with perfect precision. Play behaviors, emotional responses, learning patterns, all optimized for maximum benefit. Jake looked up from the blocks, watching as the Trilaxian child carefully balanced one piece on top of another with intense concentration. "Then why isn't your kid happy?" he asked gently. Ambassador Chen had no answer for that. His child was certainly developing according to all the proper metrics. Physical growth was optimal, cognitive development was ahead of schedule, and nutritional intake was precisely calibrated. But looking at his offspring now, laughing and playing with simple blocks, Chen was seeing something he'd never witnessed before. Joy. Pure, uncomplicated happiness. "Sometimes the old ways work best," Jake said, helping the child start a new tower. It wasn't meant as criticism, just a simple observation from someone who'd grown up in a world where children still played with wooden blocks and sang silly songs. The station's scientific staff was having a field day trying to document what Jake was doing. Dr. Rachel Green from the Xenopsychology department followed him around with cameras and sensors, recording every interaction. Dr. Watson took blood samples and brain scans from the children before and after Jake's visits. Other specialists filled notebook after notebook with observations, trying to quantify the unquantifiable. "We're measuring neurotransmitter release, social bonding indicators, stress reduction markers," Dr. Green explained to Commander Hayes. "But we're missing something fundamental. It's like trying to measure love with a calculator." Jake overheard this conversation while cleaning nearby and couldn't help but smile. How do you measure the value of a gentle touch or a patient smile? How do you quantify the importance of someone simply being present when a child needs comfort? These were things humans had understood instinctively for generations, not because they were smarter than other species, but because their own evolution had demanded it. Human children required years of intensive care and emotional bonding to survive. Other species had evolved more efficient methods, but in gaining efficiency, they'd lost something precious. They'd optimized away the very behaviors that made childhood magical. As Jake watched alien children from dozens of different worlds discover the simple pleasure of human games and songs, he realized something profound was happening. These advanced civilizations were getting their first glimpse of what they'd given up in their rush toward technological perfection. And judging by the expressions on the parents' faces, they were beginning to wonder if the trade had been worth it. Dr. Rachel Green had been studying alien psychology for 15 years, but she'd never encountered anything quite like what she was witnessing in the station's converted recreation room. Jake Miller sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by what looked like the galaxy's most unusual daycare center. A Kithran cub was curled up in his lap, purring softly. Two Deltan children floated in small hoverchairs nearby, giggling as they played with colorful ribbons Jake had fashioned from old maintenance tape. A young Trilaxian was carefully arranging bottle caps into intricate patterns, completely absorbed in the simple activity. "Your species maintains extensive parental care periods," Dr. Green observed, making notes on her tablet while trying to keep her voice low enough not to disturb the children. "Human offspring require what, 16 to 18 years of intensive care before achieving full independence? Most civilizations have streamlined child rearing for maximum efficiency." Jake looked up from helping a small, crystalline being from the Nexus Collective stack plastic containers. The child's body was translucent, like living glass, and it chimed softly whenever it moved. "Kids need to feel safe," he said simply, his voice carrying that same gentle tone he used with all the children. "Doesn't matter what planet they are from, what they look like, or how their parents evolved. They all need the same basic things." Dr. Green watched as Jake demonstrated how to make towers with the containers, showing the young Nexus child that it was okay when the towers fell down. The child's chiming became more musical, what she recognized as their species' version of laughter. "But surely you must realize how inefficient this approach is? These children could be learning advanced mathematics, multiple languages, complex problem-solving skills. Instead, they're playing with garbage." "It's not garbage," Jake said, catching a Zenthari lava as it tumbled during an enthusiastic game of what humans called Ring Around the Rosie. The lava's compound eyes sparkled with joy as Jake spun it gently in his arms. "It's discovery. They're learning that the world is safe, that adults can be trusted, that trying new things won't hurt them. You can't download that kind of knowledge into their brains." Ambassador Patricia Williams of the Axiom Collective had been standing in the doorway for several minutes, watching this scene with visible confusion. Her people were renowned throughout the galaxy for their logical perfection. The Axiom had eliminated emotional responses millennia ago, viewing them as evolutionary waste that clouded judgment and reduced efficiency. They were brilliant negotiators, master strategists, and technological innovators. They were also, Jake had noticed, profoundly unhappy. She approached hesitantly, her movements precise and calculated like everything else about her species. "Mr. Miller," she said, her voice carrying no emotional inflection whatsoever, "my offspring has shown measurable behavioral improvements following your interactions. Stress indicators have decreased by 37%, learning retention has increased by 22%, and social engagement markers have risen dramatically." Jake looked over at her child, a small version of Ambassador Williams with the same silvery skin and large, dark eyes. The child was sitting slightly apart from the others, watching their play with obvious longing but seeming unable to join in. Jake had seen this before in children whose parents discouraged emotional expression. "How do you achieve these results without neural modification or pharmaceutical intervention?" Ambassador Williams continued. "Our medical staff has analyzed your methods and found no technological component whatsoever. Yet the outcomes exceed our most advanced treatments." Jake gently disentangled himself from the other children and walked over to Ambassador Williams' offspring. The child looked up at him with those large, solemn eyes, and Jake could see years of suppressed feelings locked away behind them. He knelt down and held out his arms in invitation. "Come here, sweetheart," he said softly. The child looked uncertainly at its mother, who gave a barely perceptible nod. When Jake picked up the small axiom, the child immediately nestled against his shoulder, finally allowing itself to accept the comfort it had been craving. Jake could feel some of the tension leave the small body as it relaxed into his embrace. "I don't do anything special," Jake said to Ambassador Williams, gently stroking the child's back. "I just pay attention to what they need. Food when they are hungry, sleep when they are tired, comfort when they are scared, and someone who cares about them just because they exist." Dr. Green was writing frantically, trying to capture every detail of the interaction. "This is remarkable," she murmured. "Humanity's extended childhood period created caregivers who respond to emotional needs instinctively. Your species had to develop these behaviors or your children wouldn't survive. But other civilizations found more efficient methods." "More efficient, maybe," Jake said, still holding the axiom child who had begun to make soft, contented sounds. "But not better." The truth was becoming clear to everyone in the room. The Zenthri had developed neural dampeners that eliminated childhood distress but also reduced creativity and emotional intelligence. The Trilaxians used automated care pods that met every physical need but provided no emotional connection. The axiom had simply programmed emotions out of their children entirely, viewing them as unnecessary complications. Each species had solved the problem of child rearing in their own way, optimizing for efficiency, logic, and measurable outcomes. They had created generations of functional, productive citizens who excelled at their assigned roles in society. But they had also created something else entirely, something none of them had intended. They had created children who didn't know how to be happy. The advancement came at a cost, Dr. Green said, her voice filled with a sadness that surprised her. She was looking around the room at alien children who were experiencing joy, wonder, and playfulness for the first time in their lives. In optimizing child rearing, these civilizations lost the ability to simply comfort their own offspring. Ambassador Williams watched as her child finally laughed, a sound so rare among her people that she actually stepped backward in shock. "We believed emotional responses were primitive," she said quietly. "Remnants of an evolutionary past that served no purpose in an advanced society." "Maybe being primitive isn't always a bad thing," Jake said, setting the axiom child down so it could join the other children in their play. "Maybe some things are worth keeping, even if they're not efficient." The realization was spreading through the diplomatic community like ripples in a pond. Their technological advancement, their scientific achievements, their perfect societies, had all come at the same price. They had optimized away their own humanity, and only now, watching their children discover simple joy through the eyes of a human janitor, were they beginning to understand what they had lost. 3 months later, Jake Miller found himself standing in the most important room in the galaxy, wearing his faded blue maintenance uniform and trying not to fidget with the mop handle he'd brought along out of habit. The Galactic Council chamber was enormous, with representatives from hundreds of worlds arranged in ascending circles that seemed to stretch up forever. The air hummed with translation devices working overtime, converting thousands of different languages into something resembling universal understanding. Jake had cleaned this room dozens of times, usually in the middle of the night when it was empty and quiet. He knew every corner, every light fixture, every scratch on the polished floor. But he'd never imagined he'd be standing here as anything other than the guy who emptied the trash cans. Commander Lisa Hayes stood at the central podium, holding a formal document that looked far too official for something that had started with a crying baby. Her voice carried clearly through the vast chamber as she read, by unanimous vote of the Galactic Council, we hereby establish human caregiving protocols for all diplomatic facilities throughout known space. The words echoed off the curved walls, and Jake still couldn't quite believe this was real. Behind him, in a special observation area, he could see the faces of children and parents from dozens of different worlds. The Kithran cubs were there, now healthy and happy, their silvery fur gleaming under the chamber lights. The young Deltan child floated in her hoverchair, making musical sounds of contentment. Even the small Axiom offspring was present, no longer the withdrawn, silent creature Jake had first met, but a child who laughed and played like any other. Mr. Miller, Commander Hayes continued, your official job description will now include the title of Interspecies Child Comfort Specialist, in addition to your maintenance duties. Jake couldn't help but grin at the absurdity of it all. 6 months ago, he'd been worried about getting written up for using too much floor cleaner. Now he was being given an official title that probably didn't exist anywhere else in the universe. The best part was, he'd still get to mop floors. There was something satisfying about honest work, something that felt real and important even when nobody was watching. The changes over the past 3 months had been remarkable. Jake's daily routine now included scheduled visits to the diplomatic quarters, where he spent time with alien children whose parents were slowly learning that efficiency wasn't everything. He'd rock crying babies to sleep, play simple games with toddlers, and teach parents the forgotten arts that humanity had never given up. The power of a lullaby, it turned out, was truly universal. Jake had learned to hum melodies that worked for different species, songs that matched their hearing ranges and emotional needs. He discovered that peekaboo was apparently hilarious to creatures from every corner of the galaxy, and that building blocks never got old, no matter how advanced your civilization was. The Kithran cubs had become his most devoted followers. They would wait by his supply closet every morning, their little faces pressed against the viewing panels, tails wagging with excitement when they saw him coming. During his cleaning rounds, they trailed behind him like fuzzy shadows, chattering in their musical language while he worked. Their parents had been amazed by the transformation. The cubs were not only healthier and happier, but they were also showing improved learning abilities and social skills that their species had thought were impossible to develop naturally. Our preliminary studies suggest significant benefits from these primitive caregiving methods, reported Dr. Watson to the assembled council. Children exposed to human-style emotional nurturing show improved cognitive development, enhanced creativity, better stress management, and stronger social bonds. What we initially dismissed as inefficient appears to be remarkably effective. But perhaps the most dramatic change was in the parents themselves. Ambassador Kira of the Deltan Republic had started singing to her daughter, something Deltans hadn't done for generations. The Zenthari delegate had dismantled her automated care systems and was learning to play simple games with her larvae. Even Ambassador Williams of the Axiom Collective had begun showing physical affection to her child, breaking thousands of years of cultural conditioning. The humans call it love, Ambassador Kira reported to her homeworld during one of her regular communications. We are studying its practical applications and measuring its effects on childhood development. Initial results suggest this emotion may be far more useful than previously calculated. Jake had to bite his lip to keep from laughing when he heard that report. Leave it to an alien civilization to turn love into a research project. But he understood what she was trying to do. Her people needed scientific justification for behaviors that humans took for granted. If calling it practical applications of emotional bonding helped them accept the importance of simply caring for their children, that was fine with him. The training programs had been the most rewarding part of the whole experience. Jake watched from across the room as Ambassador Patricia Rogers, the human representative to the Trilaxian Republic, demonstrated proper bedtime routines to a group of confused but eager alien parents. She showed them how to dim the lights gradually, how to speak in soothing tones, and how to use gentle physical contact to help children feel safe and secure. The key, Ambassador Rogers explained to a Zenthari parent who was taking careful notes, is consistency and patience. Children need to know what to expect, and they need to feel that the adults in their lives genuinely care about their well-being. The Zenthari nodded thoughtfully, her compound eyes reflecting the soft lighting of the demonstration room. And this requires no technological enhancement? No neural modification or pharmaceutical support. Just time and attention, Jake called out from where he was organizing toys made from recycled maintenance supplies. Sometimes the most advanced thing you can do is remember how to care. As the official ceremony concluded and the various delegates began filing out of the council chamber, Jake found himself surrounded by the children who had become such an important part of his daily routine. They didn't understand the politics or the significance of what had just happened. They just knew that Jake was their friend, the adult who always had time for them, who never seemed too busy or too important to play a game or give a hug when they needed one. Looking around at these young faces from across the galaxy, Jake realized something profound had occurred. Humanity's greatest contribution to galactic civilization wasn't their technology or their weapons or even their diplomatic skills. It was something much simpler and much more powerful, the radical idea that children deserve gentle hands and patient hearts, regardless of what species they belonged to or what planet they called home. In the end, the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy had needed to learn from humanity's most basic instinct, the simple act of loving a child.